It's the morning of February 15th, 1971. You went to bed the previous night, knowing there were 12 pennies in a shilling, 20 shillings in a pound, and 240 pennies to the pound. Complicated, sure, but it was what you'd always known. You could calculate change in your head faster than any modern calculator because you'd been doing it since you were 5 years old. Then you wake up and everything's changed. The shilling is gone, the florin is gone, half the coins in your pocket are worthless. The government has decided, without really asking you, that Britain will join the modern world and adopt decimal currency. 100 new pence to the pound. Simple, logical, and absolutely wrong to millions of British people who felt like something deeply British had been stolen from them overnight. This is Decimal Day, the day Britain changed its money and lost a piece of its soul. If you are wondering why people were so upset, why the change felt like such a violation, you need to understand what old money actually was. The system Britain used before 1971 was traditional, a connection to the past stretching back centuries. Pounds, shillings, and pence, from the Latin librae, solidi, denari, had been Britain's money since Anglo-Saxon times. The basic structure hadn't changed in over 1,000 years. Kings and queens had come and gone, empires had risen and fallen, but the money remained constant. 12 pennies made a shilling, 20 shillings made a pound. 240 pennies made a pound. It was complicated, irrational, difficult to explain to foreigners, and absolutely perfect if you'd grown up with it. The complexity was the point, in a way. Mastering old money was proof you were properly British, properly educated, capable of navigating the world. British school children spent years learning to add, subtract, multiply, and divide in base 12 and base 20 simultaneously. A simple shopping calculation adding up the cost of bread, milk, and butter required 3 separate columns of arithmetic. Teachers drilled it into you. Get it wrong, and the teacher would rap your knuckles with a ruler, literally sometimes, because this wasn't optional knowledge. It was survival, being able to function in the world. But the coins themselves were what people really loved. They had weight, character, history embedded in metal. The penny was huge. 4 of them bought a loaf of bread. 2 of them bought a newspaper. They were real money, not symbols, but actual valuable objects. The penny was so large and heavy that carrying a pocketful of them was heavy, made your coat pocket sag, but that weight meant something. The halfpenny was smaller, the smallest denomination, worth half a penny, obviously. You needed them for prices that ended in halfpence, which was most prices because shopkeepers priced things precisely. The halfpenny lets you buy things for thruppence, halfpenny or 1 and 6 halfpenny, awkward. Amounts that required exact change and careful counting. Then there was the threepenny bit, a 12-sided brass coin that was uniquely British, quirky, and beloved. Before 193.7, it had been a tiny silver coin, but the brass 12-sided version, introduced that year, became iconic. It was thick, solid, oddly shaped, unmistakable in your pocket or in the dark. Children loved them because they looked special, different from other coins, like treasure from a story. The thruppenny bit was Christmas pudding money. You'd hide one in the pudding, and whoever found it got luck for the year. It was charm and currency combined. The sixpence was silver, smaller than the thruppenny bit, but more valuable, elegant, and practical. 2 tanners made a shilling. It was the coin for sweets, for comics, for small treats. Here's a tanner for the shop, your mum would say, and you'd run to the corner shop and buy a comic and sweets and still have change. The tanner was generosity and independence for children learning to handle money. The shilling itself was the workhorse coin, what most transactions revolved around. A shilling was 12 pennies, or 5 new pence later, but that conversion would never feel right to people who'd used shillings their whole lives. A shilling bought fish and chips, a ticket to the cinema, and an hour of parking. It was substantial, important, the baseline for medium transactions. People thought in shillings. That costs 5 bob meant 5 shillings. And everyone knew exactly what that meant in terms of value, in terms of what you could buy with it. The florin was 2 shillings exactly, a larger silver coin that felt important, substantial. It was the coin for bigger purchases, for paying taxi fares, for settling small debts. The half-crown was 2 shillings and sixpence, the largest commonly used coin, heavy enough to be satisfying, valuable enough to matter. A half-crown in your pocket meant you were solvent, meant you could handle unexpected expenses, meant security, and the crown, 5 shillings, was rare, special, usually only minted for commemorative occasions. You didn't spend crowns, you kept them, treasured them, showed them to visitors as conversation pieces. Each coin had character, had a place in the system, and in people's affections. The monarch's head on one side, various symbols on the other, Britannia, the royal coat of arms, flowers representing the nations of the UK. The coins told stories, represented tradition, felt British in a way that was difficult to articulate but deeply felt. Children grew up learning the coins, learning the vocabulary, learning the mental arithmetic. But the world was changing. The Commonwealth was moving toward decimal systems. Australia decimalised in 1966, New Zealand in 1967, following America's lead rather than Britain's tradition. Everything would be easier with decimal currency, they said. Businesses were demanding it. Economists were demanding it. Accountants pointed out how much time was wasted on complicated calculations that decimal systems did automatically. The government, looking at the cost of minting so many different denominations, the difficulty of teaching it to new generations who would increasingly need to work in international contexts, decided enough was enough. Britain would decimalize. The decision was announced in 1966 by Chancellor James Callaghan. 5 years warning to prepare the public, to plan the transition, to print educational materials, to convince a skeptical nation that this was necessary and inevitable and not the end of civilization, even though it felt like it to many. The government launched a massive publicity campaign, one of the largest public education efforts in British history. They sent a decimal currency handbook to every household in Britain, 14 million copies explaining in simple language how the new system would work, what the new coins would look like, why this was a good idea actually. The handbook had conversion tables, example calculations, diagrams of the new coins. It was comprehensive, well-designed, and deeply resented by people who felt they were being patronized, being told their money was wrong and needed fixing. They ran television advertisements with annoyingly catchy jingles that everyone remembers even now, 50 years later. The ads were relentlessly cheerful, featuring cartoon characters and simple animations explaining that a shilling would become 5 new pence, that everything would be simpler and better and nothing to worry about. The jingles were designed to be memorable, to stick in your head, to make the change feel friendly and inevitable rather than imposed and unwelcome. Characters like Mr. Decimal appeared on children's television, explaining the new system in simple terms, trying to make it fun, trying to make children excited about losing the money they'd always known. Schools began teaching decimal currency alongside pounds, shillings, and pence. Children learned to count in hundreds, learned that 100 new pence would make a pound, learned the new coins before they existed. Practice tills were installed in schools, practice money like cardboard coins printed with the new denominations, so children could play shop with decimal currency and could get used to the idea before it became real. The children adapted quickly, they always do. Their brains were still flexible, still learning, and a new monetary system was just another thing to absorb. But their parents and grandparents struggled, resented being made to learn a new system in middle age or retirement, felt patronized by adverts and handbooks explaining things as if they were simple when the emotional weight of the change was anything but simple. For someone in their 60s who'd used pounds, shillings, and pence for their entire life, who could calculate complex change instantly without thinking, being told they needed to learn to count differently, felt insulting, degrading, and wrong. Banks prepared frantically. Every bank in Britain would need to convert every account, every ledger, every transaction from old money to new. The decision was made to close all banks for 4 days, from the close of business Thursday, February 11th, until reopening on Tuesday, February 16th, to give time for the conversion. Staff worked around the clock during those 4 days, manually converting account balances, checking and double-checking because mistakes would be catastrophic. Someone with $100, 15 shillings and 8 pence in their account would wake up on Tuesday to find they had 178. The conversion was precise. Each old penny became 0.41667 new pence, rounded to the nearest new penny when necessary, but doing this for millions of accounts required extraordinary effort. Building societies, post office savings accounts, pension funds, everything had to be converted simultaneously, accurately, or the entire financial system would collapse into chaos. The scale was staggering. Every price, every contract, every debt, every asset valued in pounds, shillings, and pence had to be converted to decimal. Mortgage statements, insurance policies, rent agreements, wage slips, and millions of documents needed updating. The administrative burden was enormous, and it all had to happen over one weekend. Shops received new tills, new price labels, instructions on how to handle the transition period. For months before D-Day, shops began displaying prices in both old and new money. The signs would read, showing both the old 2 shillings and sixpence and the new 12.5 pence. Dual pricing was meant to help people adjust, to let them see the equivalence. In practice, it was confusing, made shops look cluttered, and highlighted just how much rounding was happening because you couldn't have half pence in the new system. Prices that ended in awkward amounts had to be rounded up or down. Cashiers were trained to give change in new money, to explain conversions to confused customers, to be patient with the elderly who didn't understand and resented having to learn. Special training sessions were held, practice transactions conducted, and scripts provided for dealing with angry or confused customers. "I'm sorry, madam. We're all learning together," became the standard response to complaints while providing no actual help. The Royal Mint worked overtime, producing billions of new coins. The new penny would be much smaller than the old penny, but worth 2.4 times as much. This would become a major source of resentment. How could something so small be worth more? It felt like a trick, like the government was giving you less and calling it more. And then came February 15th, 1971, Decimal Day. People woke up to a new monetary system whether they wanted it or not. Shops opened with new prices, new tills, new coins. The old pennies, the thruppenny bits, the half-crowns were no longer legal tender, nothing but metal and memory, except it wasn't quite that clean. The transition was messy, frustrating for everyone involved. Shops displayed double pricing for weeks, some for months, because customers needed to see both systems to understand what they were paying. Cashiers had to handle two different types of coins simultaneously. Queues at checkouts became longer, slower, and more frustrating. Every transaction took twice as long as normal because cashiers had to explain, customers had to count unfamiliar coins, and confusion reigned. "Is this enough?" people would ask, holding out a handful of new coins. Unable to calculate if they had the right amount, cashiers would count it for them, explain the change, and hand back new coins that customers would examine suspiciously, unsure if they'd been cheated, unsure if the system itself was honest. The older generation struggled desperately. People in their 60s, 70s, 80s had used pounds, shillings, and pence their entire lives. They could calculate change instantly in the old system, could spot a mistake immediately, could count money by touch and weight, and didn't need to see the coins to know what they had. The new system baffled them. A shopping trip became an ordeal of confusion and embarrassment. You'd stand at the checkout trying to work out how much to pay, counting out coins uncertainly, hoping you'd got it right, seeing the impatience of younger customers behind you, feeling stupid and lost in a country that no longer made sense. Some elderly people stopped going to shops, sent younger relatives instead, and avoided the humiliation of not being able to count their own money. Others carried conversion cards, little printed tables showing old money equivalents, consulting them for every purchase, taking forever, holding up queues. The government had promised this would be simple for people who'd mastered the complexity of pounds, shillings, and pence. This new, simple system was incomprehensible. Many genuinely believed they were being cheated. The new coins were so much smaller than the old ones. How could a tiny new penny be worth more than two of the big old pennies? Everything about the new money felt like play money rather than real currency. Prices rose noticeably in the months after decimalization, and while some of that was normal inflation, some of it was definitely shopkeepers taking advantage of confusion to bump prices up. Consumer advocacy groups began complaining loudly. Newspapers ran articles exposing excessive rounding, naming shops, and demanding action, but nothing changed. The damage was done. Decimalization became associated in many people's minds with being cheated, with the cost of living increasing for no good reason. People mourned the lost coins with genuine grief, but gradually they disappeared from circulation. Banks withdrew them, people hoarded them, and by the late 1970s, getting a sixpence in your change was a rare moment of nostalgia. When sixpences finally ceased to be legal tender on June 30th, 1980, it felt like the last connection to the old system had been severed, like Britain had finally and completely become a different country. The generational divide widened. The old could remember both systems, could convert between them instantly even decades later, and could mourn what had been lost. The young only knew decimals, couldn't imagine why anyone would want a complicated system of 12s and 20s, couldn't understand the attachment to old coins. We lost the florin and the shilling, but we gained the simplicity of the hundred. Yet for some, the pound has never felt quite as heavy since. Do you remember Decimal Day? Did you keep a jar of the old big pennies under your bed? Share your memories of the big switch in the comments.